Right, I'm talking about criminalizing agency costs, and I just want to emphasize that I am here almost strictly as a corporate law and economic scholar, and I don't do criminal law. I'm not immersed in the criminal justice system like just about everybody that you've heard so far today. And I really do not have a clear normative kind of answer to a lot of the questions that have been raised today. What I'm going to try to emphasize here is a perspective that I think is important to take on a lot of these problems that we've been listening to and discussing. And also I want to emphasize that I'm not talking about the whole range of, basically I'm not going to be talking about prosecutorial behavior or misbehavior, although I do have a slide kind of fitting it into the corporate perspective here. I'm not going to be talking about how corporations are all good and do lots of good things and don't do any bad things, but I do want to put some of this into perspective. And again, that's the agency cost kind of view that I'm taking. This is the overview of what I'm planning on talking about today. And just to be clear, this is not about the range of kinds of issues that we've talked about today: pollution, discrimination, all the kinds of things that corporations are prosecuted for. Henry wanted me to focus on the financial crisis, so that's what I'm doing in this little session. I think some of the things that I'm talking about are generalizable. In fact, most of the things that I'm talking about are generalizable to the other topics, the other forms of behavior, corporate behavior that we've been talking about, but I'm focusing on the financial crisis. So particularly individual behavior of the sort that's listed on the slide: misrepresentations, shenanigans with manipulating transactions so that they are possibly misleading, insider trading, stealing from the corporation, the things that individuals do in the company. And then I want to take all those categories of behavior. I'm not going to talk about each one in detail. I think you basically understand the kinds of behavior that I've listed there. But I do want to talk about a few specific kinds of problems. Again, this is the perspective that I'm trying to bring to this discussion. A few specific kinds of problems with prosecuting this kind of behavior criminally. And that's a really important emphasis here, because I don't mean to say for a second that any of this is good. Any of this behavior should be engaged in. What I want to say is that there are special problems of viewing this behavior criminally. And there have been some comments today in general, particularly by Jeff Parker earlier, about the problems of criminalizing any corporate conduct. I'm not necessarily ready in this talk to go down that road of saying I have a theory about what kinds of corporate conduct ought to be criminalized and what kinds shouldn't be. But I will say that I am very skeptical about the benefits, and certainly on a cost-benefit basis, of criminalizing this particular type of behavior. And I just want to, I hope that you get from my talk the reason that I say that and the perspective that I'm coming from. And as Henry said, this is something certainly up for debate and discussion. And all I want to do is make sure that you understand the perspective. So, agency costs, what do I mean? If you're an owner of a company and you delegate, and you might be a collective, you might be a whole bunch of shareholders, and you delegate discretion to somebody who's not the sole owner of the company to exercise power, to manage the company, you have, by delegating that discretion, created not just the potential, but the actuality of agency costs. Because there's going to be a conflict of interest. There's going to be different incentives between this agent who is not the owner and you who are the owner. And this agent may end up being completely honest. You may end up with a completely honest agent, but the difference in incentives is going to engender some agency costs. The way maybe that you got this agent to be honest is to say that you're going to execute him if he makes any kind of mistake. or you're going to take his firstborn or cut off his arm, that would be one way to keep him honest, but there's obviously cost to that kind of discipline. So as a result, since we don't usually go down those extreme paths, except Mr. Howard earlier talked about China, but at least here, we don't usually go down those extreme paths. We can expect all agents to be at least a little unfaithful. So one kind of really important point that I just want to emphasize, which should be, I think, pretty intuitively obvious, is that agency costs are completely pervasive in any large organization, including corporations. You just cannot escape them. And there's a lot of particular reasons for that that are listed on the slide. It's never quite clear to the agent exactly how much authority they have, what the principal necessarily wants the agent to do for the company. Again, as I said, the incentives of the agent and principal are always to some extent in conflict because the agent, by definition, is not the sole owner and therefore is going to not bear all the costs of his actions. So therefore, there's necessarily going to be a difference of incentives. There's going to be some incentive with respect, or difference of incentives with respect to risk. In a public corporation particularly, the shareholders are diversified. They are indifferent to what the economists call unsystematic risk. That is the risk that you can eliminate by putting together a diversified portfolio of shares. Executives have their entire human capital. They have their jobs and so forth, maybe a lot of their financial well-being invested in the company. They haven't diversified all that away. So right there, they're going to want to take less risk with the company than the shareholders are. So that's just one of many kinds of agency costs that, and again, I think you can't completely avoid that. I mentioned that last bullet point on the slide, the easy path to crime. I think is worth mentioning here because one of the general ideas, obviously we're talking about corporate crime, is can you eliminate this, or is the criminal justice system the best way of eliminating these agency costs? Well, again, you can't eliminate them, but you can cause some trouble by introducing criminal law in this area. And one trouble is, as soon as you decide that you're going to criminalize this agent behavior, you've made that person a criminal, obviously, and you've given that person an incentive to cover up. So right there you've introduced maybe a conflict of interest between the entity that wants the agent to disclose and the now criminal agent that wants to cover up. So not only are you not going to be able to eliminate agency costs, but you're going to be introducing some problems with the criminal justice system. So again, agency costs are fundamental. Now, how do we deal with agency costs in the corporation? And again, I'm coming at this not as a prosecutor, not as somebody who's immersed in the criminal justice system, but as just a very boring corporate law scholar who gets occasionally to do something interesting, like come and talk about criminal law. So how do we deal with this pervasive agency cost? We've got a whole bunch of devices that I've listed on the slide. The shareholders vote. You've got directors that oversee managers' conduct. You've got what's been referred to as the market for control, the takeover market, where somebody buys control and throws the bums out. You've got reputational incentives. You've got the fact that the executive may want to move to another job. And of course, as we've seen, we've heard all day long, you've also got civil liability. You've got those class action lawyers who are going to show up at your doorstep. So there's all kinds of ways to discipline agency costs. And the question is, what do we need? Do we really need the criminal law on top of it? And what are the costs of bringing in the criminal law on top of all the rest of this incentive system that I just referred to? So the question is, what kinds of agency misconduct, given that it's inevitable, what kinds of agency misconduct should be criminal? Okay, I guess that slide didn't position quite right, but one thing that you've got, one kind of agency problem that you have in large firms is information problems, which is what this slide deals with. So the entity, the corporation, wants the agent to be completely forthcoming because the entity wants to know everything that it needs to know in order to make sure that it's well run. That's the entity's interest. But again, agency costs are pervasive. The agent, for a lot of reasons, maybe different time horizons with his pay, all kinds of different kinds of incentives, the agent does not want to give all of the information to the entity that the entity wants. So what I'm trying to do here is to show you that information problems, which obviously gets us closer to the financial crisis kinds of things that I'm focusing on, information problems are part of this pervasive problem of agency costs. Add to that the problems of disciplining, the other kinds of logistical problems of disciplining disclosure in a large organization. Who said what? When? Obviously, we know what kinds of problems those issues entail. What's true at any given time? In other words, what is the actual financial condition of a company at any particular moment in time? When you're talking about a large corporation, including a corporation, say, as large as Tyco, which we've been hearing about, that might be a more difficult kind of question than you might think. So those are, in addition to disciplining pervasive agency problems, you have these other kinds of logistical problems entailed with the criminal justice system. So again, I keep coming back to the question, given these problems, to what extent should this conduct be subject to the criminal justice system? Now, I hope that slide is visible, but or at least the writing on the slide is visible. But now I'm sort of changing the subject a little bit to, okay, how have we decided, what's the process by which we have decided which kinds of agency costs should be criminalized? And the answer is, and I talked about this a few years ago in an article I called Bubble Laws, if you look at this historically, every single major financial regulation that we've had over time has been the product of, or something has followed on, a financial bubble. So right there I've got 300 years of history on the screen going back to the South Sea bubble. And every time there was a bubble, there was then a movement to hang the agents out to dry. So we haven't necessarily gotten the kind of deliberative legislative process or adjudicative process that we might have wanted in each of those cases. So what this has produced, I think, to some extent, the pervasiveness of agency costs in a large organization, the difficulty of trying to figure out which kinds of agency costs ought to be criminalized, is that we've had to draw some very close lines, necessarily. There's no way of avoiding this. There's nobody at fault for drawing the lines in the wrong place. We've had to draw some very close lines. And again, the question is, should these lines be the kinds of lines that the criminal justice system draws, where we think about moral distinctions or distinctions that rise to a moral dimension, but again, when you have pervasive agency costs and you have to make these close distinctions, you're not going to get those kinds of lines. So I've got various categories of the financial crimes that have come up just in the last few years. The bank run problem that I'll elucidate a little bit on the next slide, where you get statements at the end. This is kind of the end game. Statements at the end of the corporation's life when you're trying to figure out what's going on in the company, and it might be going down the tubes fast and the situation's changing minute by minute. Some of that's fraud, some of it isn't. How do you tell? Should that be a criminal distinction? Backdating, we've got complex accounting rules, and we're criminalizing some kinds of accounting decisions. Close decisions, should that be part of the criminal justice system? Well, I just want to elucidate a little bit the bank run problem. Look at this at statements on the slide. I think those are visible now. I hope you can see just from a glance at the slide that what we're talking about here are some very similar statements. Ken Lay, our liquidity is fine. Lehman Brothers, in March 2008, our liquidity is fine. Alan Schwartz of Bear Stearns, and 5 days before it went under or so, our liquidity is fine. Matthew Tannen of the Bear Stearns hedge fund, who's now subject to criminal charges. We're comfortable with where we are. George Bailey, I'm sure you all know George Bailey from that's Jimmy Stewart in It's a Wonderful Life. We wouldn't think that Jimmy Stewart is a criminal, but he came pretty close to Ken Lay's conduct in It's a Wonderful Life. Finally, and I'm out of time, and this might be, in the view of some of the discussion earlier in the day, a good time to stop. But I want to point out that just like corporate employees, corporate executives, or agents, so are prosecutors, which is not to say that I think that prosecutors are bad people at all. I guess what I would ask here with this slide is, if corporate agents are imperfect, can we expect prosecutors to be perfect? I think they're drawn out of the same general pool of very intelligent, high-achieving individuals who are subject to conflicts of interest, maybe of a different type, but of the type that can give rise to agency costs. So again, going back to what I said at the beginning, my one recommendation is just to be aware of the pervasiveness of agency costs, the difficulty of drawing bright lines, and I think the need to be sensitive to these problems in passing legislation and adjudicating cases. Thank you.